Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's European Greenleaf webinar. Our subject tonight is rivers, and we're delighted to have as our presenter tonight Professor Ken Whelan. Ken has many claims to fame. He's an adjunct professor in the School of Biology and Environmental Science in UCD. He's also a research director with Atlantic Salmon Trust, an internationally renowned expert on Atlantic salmon, and a regular contributor to Mooney Goes Wild. So with that, I'll hopefully hand you over to Ken.
Good evening, everybody, and you're welcome indeed to our webinar this evening. First of all, I just want to thank Anne and to thank Limerick City and County Council indeed for inviting me to give the webinar this evening in the context of this Green Leaf series of webinars, which has been very successful to date. So hopefully this evening I'll give you just a flavour of what we have in terms of the rivers and streams in Ireland and what we need to do to try and preserve these streams and some of the threats. I'll only have time to talk a little bit about some of the threats that are facing these beautiful watercourses. So Anne, if it's okay then, I'll get cracking with the webinar. A little bit then about Irish rivers and life in Irish rivers. I think really to give you an idea of the history and the background of these beautiful waters, I think we have to start off by looking at where they actually came from and talk a little bit about the glacial history of the rivers in Ireland. This leads on directly then to the whole question of geology and soils, the rocks over which these rivers flow and the soils over which they flow. We'll talk a little bit then about life in these rivers, obviously, and we look at two types of life. We look at the invertebrate life, the life without a backbone, and we look at life with a backbone. In terms of the impacts and the insults that these rivers, in common with many rivers around the world, I really don't have time to deal with many of the different issues that are common, as I say, in a lot of watercourses across the globe. But what I will talk a little bit about is flooding and drainage, two areas in Ireland which are very common at the moment in terms of discussion amongst those of us that are involved with rivers and the management of rivers. And it links in directly then with the whole question of climate change and indeed the whole question of invasive species. And then to finish then on a much more positive note, because we have a lot to be grateful for at the moment in terms of the various initiatives that are being taken. And to use a very well-worn phrase at this stage, we're attempting in Ireland to actually look at really taking this idea of a bottom-up approach seriously and trying to then train our volunteers so that they can act in a very real sense as agents for change in terms of the improvement of these particular watercourses. And I'll end then by talking a little bit about the role which communities can play and which citizen science can play in raising awareness. And not just raising awareness, we need to go beyond that. We need to arm our citizen scientists so that they can actually collect data, because for so long we have been in a situation where we have to some extent downgraded the value of the communications we were getting from local communities. And certainly as scientists, myself and my colleagues at times may have regarded these as purely observational. And what we're trying to do at this stage, certainly in Ireland, is to arm these groups with the ability to be able to collect real numbers and real data. So where did it all come from? Well, really, we have to look back into the ice to understand really what's happening in terms of our rivers and where our rivers are heading for. And most of us, when we were in school, we will have heard about the most recent ice age, which really stretched between 10,000 and 7,000 years ago. And that, in terms of the age of the Earth, is a relatively short period of time. But the actual ice age that we speak about at that time, it commenced far, far, far back. It commenced some 75,000 years ago, and indeed was at its maximum extent about 27,000 years ago. And that's what the geologists call the last glacial maximum. So that's when, in the context of Britain and Ireland in particular, we know now that they were fully covered with ice at this time. And the last glacial termination, when all this started to change and started to end, it really began about 20,000 years ago. And it took a long, long time to actually recede the ice. And it was essentially complete about 7,000 years ago. We have to remember as well that in terms of this last glacial maximum, when these huge sheets of ice were covering Britain and Ireland, they were absolutely immense. And it's only relatively recently that we understood that a lot of the edges and the margins of this big ice sheet were actually marine-based. And they stretched far, far out west, well beyond what would be the limits of the current Irish coastline. So there was a huge area of ice, similar in extent to the ice sheets that you would see now in the Antarctic. But it's the marine deposits off the Irish coast that have given us the evidence that we really needed to understand exactly what was happening around that time. Certainly when I was at school, these were the types of diagrams that we were presented with as we did geography. There was always little gaps around the map of Ireland, little refugia as they're called, where the ice didn't really extend to these according to our teachers at that time. But in reality, that was false, because as I say, we know now that the ice sheets went way, way out beyond the west coast of Britain and Ireland, and this whole area was covered in ice. Now, when I say covered in ice, remember that it would have been pockmarked with ice. There would have been thick ice and thin ice, there would have been thawing, there would have been retreats, there would have been entrenchments as the ice actually came back. And each major retreat of the ice was accompanied by a re-entrenchment of ice. And there's now clear evidence that we got at that particular time massive flows of water, what are now called paleoflows. And these were movements of fresh water, and they occurred in areas from which ice sheets had long since disappeared. And certainly in my mind, these paleoflows may actually hold the key in terms of how quite a lot of our freshwater fauna of today actually arrived around or in the bays, the current, what we would know as the bays now. They arrived, the forerunners of all of the fauna arrived in these massive paleoflows. And such flood peaks, the most recent of which in terms of documentation occurred about 25,000 to 17,000 years ago, they were certainly caused by climatic factors such as very high rainfall, snow melt, and melting of permafrost. But we do know now that the first plant life returned to reclaim the rocky wilderness of Ireland some 13,000 years ago. And this is interesting because we'll be speaking a little later about the fish in Irish waters. And certainly the char and the very early forerunners of our brown trout, they appeared about 14,000 years ago in some of the streams and then ultimately in some of the lakes. So this was a real time of recolonization, this period from around 14,000 years ago onwards. And of course, at that stage, we had the remnants of the land bridges, and the land bridges, before they crumbled away, we certainly know that creatures like the great Irish deer and the giant deer and so on, they came across those particular land bridges. But fundamental to all of this is the geology, as I mentioned at the beginning in my introduction. And geology is basic to freshwater productivity. So it's exactly the same as it is in terms of land productivity. So the more, the softer rocks, the more productive rocks, they are the ones that actually generate life. And Ireland, with a relatively small land area, has a surprisingly complex geology. And I'll show you a very basic diagram in a moment that outlines that. But in essence, Ireland is saucer shaped. And the center of this saucer and edges moving to the east and west coast are very soft carboniferous limestone. But around the edge of Ireland, all around the rim of this saucer, you have these really, really immensely hard rocks. And in the context of the geological timescale that you're speaking about, when you're talking about ice and you're talking about geology, the timescale involved is absolutely immense. And the earliest pieces of our landscape here in Ireland were not laid down millions or hundreds of millions, but billions of years ago. So these rocks, some of them are extraordinarily old, particularly the harder rocks. Yet some of the softer rocks are relatively recent, a mere 300 million years ago. And these softer rocks, as I mentioned, they can make quite a difference. So on the right-hand side there, you see a very basic diagram showing you this etched edge with these very hard rocks, the soft limestone intrusion around Dublin, north and south of Dublin, limestone intrusions then across to the west coast. But in general, the central plain and the areas east and west of that central plain and down to the south into the Golden Vale, those areas are all soft carboniferous limestone. The harder rocks then, the granites, the micas, all of the old hard sandstones, they're all around the edge of Ireland. And there's one phrase I always use when I'm telling people about productivity. And the most important thing you need to look for are fat cattle. If you can find fat cattle, you'll find fat trout. And that really indicates that it's in an area of high productivity, an area of soft rock. So in those, in that landscape, you also have a huge mix of fascinating terrain. Left behind by the glaciers, you have what we call eskers. So you have these strings, really sort of highways of gravel and shale and shingle. And you can see the word esker in many, many locations in Ireland. And we have lots and lots of remnants where the toe of the glacier left behind all sorts of gravel and shale as it moved along. We then have the word corrie. So this is typical of a corrie lake. This is not actually a lake in Ireland, but we do have many lakes in Ireland that are very similar. I put up this diagram because it encompasses the whole of the small corrie lake. All of the soils have been ripped away by the glaciers. The last remnant just sitting here, that's been ripped away by the ice, and the corrie lake remains. Normally very, very unproductive, very deep waters, but sometimes holding very ancient trout and char. We have then a huge amount of peat bogs in Ireland, and we'll come back to those. Immensely important in terms of regulating water flows in Ireland. And then we have tiny hillocks and tiny little hills along the border country around Cavan and so on in the North Midlands, which we call drumlins. And all of these have a story to tell. And that story is all around geology. It's around the actual movement of the ice, and it's the location of the geographical features that we're looking at now post-glacial times. But to understand rivers and river flows, you have to understand a little bit about the water cycle. And at its most basic, the water cycle is to do with topography. It's to do with the shape of a river catchment. And it's to do with hydrology, the science of water. What happens to the surface water? But it's not just the surface water, which we're all familiar with, that we're interested in. We're also very interested in the groundwater. We're interested in how water is stored. We're interested in how water is lost. And most importantly, we're interested to find out what damage has been done in the past in terms of these incredible water reservoirs that we have been gifted here in Ireland. This is a very basic diagram showing the main features of what I've been speaking about. So water is retained, obviously, in terms of ice and snow. We're all familiar with the water running freely down into a stream, then down and stored perhaps in a lake, running on into the ocean. And then the water is either evaporated out or it comes out through the trees through transpiration. So at its most basic, that's what the water cycle looks like. But when we look at it in a little bit more detail, we see that there are two hugely different aspects to the cycle itself. There's the obvious aspect above ground, but most importantly, there's also a huge aspect in terms of the underwater movement of water. You have water that's actually stored underground, and you have all sorts of underground streams, streams just below the soil, streams that are deep inside the limestone. And all of these movements of water, whether it's the normal movement of water coming from the ice, as I say, coming down through the streams, coming out through the lakes and out into the ocean, then being evaporated back up into the air again, all of this cycle is hugely important. But the storage of the water in terms of storage within lakes, storage within rivers and streams, most importantly, storage within the actual landmass itself, this is a very, very delicate system. And to go at that system in a very abusive way in terms of imagining that you as a land manager can actually improve on what nature has done, I think is the height of arrogance. And really, that has led to a huge amount of problems that we see today. And I'll mention those a little later on in the webinar. The other thing to remember as well is that, and this is the first indication that I'll give you of the importance of working with communities. In the context of looking at rivers, what the hydrologists do is they tend to number the rivers depending on whether or not they are very close to the source. So a tiny little stream where the river is beginning, that's known as a first order stream. Where two first order streams come together, they become a second order stream. 2 seconds become a third, and so on and so forth. Under the European Water Framework Directive, very often the national authorities will be sampling, their highest point in sampling will be around the 3s and the 4s, somewhere in this diagram around that point. But nobody knows what's happening in these particular streams in any great detail. And what we're trying to do is to encourage community groups to actually map and assess these little feeder streams, the arteries of the system. You may very well get a reasonable water quality estimate from that particular sampling point. Physically, you will have no idea of the status of the stream. And what we're hoping, not so much that the community will find problems, but that they will identify pristine areas. These are the reservoir areas. These are the areas that actually hold the biota that will move downstream if there is a problem further downstream. So these are vitally important, and they're not really being looked at in any great detail at the moment. So in terms of the rivers themselves, I want you to try and from now on perhaps see a river and a river bank and a river canopy in a different way. And stand back in the field where you have your great big fat cattle and look at the river in total. Don't just look immediately into the water, because everything in the fields is feeding into the river. So you're looking along the river bank and you're looking at the canopy. You're looking at the bushes and the trees and the conifers, and you're looking at the interaction between the river bank and the canopy above it. You're looking, in fact, at the river corridor rather than looking at the river itself. And you're watching how the corridor moves. You're watching to see, can you sense, is it compromised? Are there trees missing from one bank? Is there a huge amount of vegetation growing on both banks? Has it been really developed in a way that isn't sensitive to what the river itself needs, which is a dappled amount of light and shade, which is plenty of pools, plenty of riffles, plenty of glides? That's what a river needs. And any change in that is a fundamental change in terms of how productive that river will be in terms of invertebrates and in terms of fish and in terms of flora. Then you start to look at the in-stream vegetation, and you look at the vegetation where the roots are actually going down into the river itself. Some of the vegetation will actually have stems. You're familiar with reeds and so on and rushes that you see along riverbanks. Some will have the actual weed itself will be underwater, and sometimes the flowers peep their head up over the water. Then you start to look at the in-stream structure, and this is where it gets really important, because to create the pools, to create the riffles, to create the glides, you need this very delicate mixture of rocks and boulders. In between that, you need cobble and you need gravel. So you're looking to create this particular sequence, this riffle glide pool sequence. You're also looking for undercut banks, because undercut banks are a real treasure trove when you're looking to try and find out what the river holds in terms of the bigger creatures, in terms of the fish, in terms of the crayfish and so on. And some of these undercut banks can be up to a meter in under the bank itself, thriving and full of life. And also in the context of climate change, we're beginning to think then that with rivers that have had our arterial drainage or rivers that have been in other ways affected by land use, it may be that there's too much sunlight now getting to them, and temperatures are rising. And we have good examples of this in Scotland, where in some of the highlands in Scotland, they're now beginning to replant some of the big estates in Scotland with only one purpose in mind, is shading the river and reducing the midsummer temperatures. So let me just show you a series of photographs of different river channels. and what you might expect and how you might see these now, hopefully with different eyes. So in that particular context there, it's a very pretty picture, but there are several problems here. There's no vegetation at all here. There's very clear signs of overgrazing. The river itself has started to braid. There's a lot of water disappearing now under those gravels. The only water we can see is on the edge here. So again, this could do with some management, where you would actually concentrate the flow, where you would put back in more vegetation, and where you could actually undo some of the damage that has been done. A relatively simple job to undo that particular corner. This is a much healthier river. Plenty of aquatic weed, as you can see. Very healthy, lovely, clean water, nice gravel, nice cobble. But again, completely denuded of trees on this particular side. Open to sunlight, which in some ways is a good thing. But what I would like to see here is a dappled situation. Perhaps here you might cut back some of the vegetation. Here you might increase the vegetation. But certainly the bushes and the grasses along the edge, vitally important in terms of the food of the fish. Again, just showing you the cover that you can get from natural in-stream vegetation. Thinking then a little bit about the geology and about the different types of rock and what they create. This, as you can see here, again, looking beyond the river, is a lowland stream. So obviously these fields look very productive. And again, this is reflected in the context of what you see here, a river with very rich flora. It was taken around May and June time, and this is a plant called ranunculus, and you can just see the flowers just peeping above the surface, as I mentioned earlier. Lots and lots of undercut bank, really, really nice shading for the fish. Again, on this side, probably too heavily grazed. Again, you would like to see that bank replicated on this side. Again, just showing you the richness of a limestone river. And certainly in Ireland, we have some absolute treasures. So this is down in County Cork. This is the Beg River. This is another County Cork river then as well. This is the Unshan River. So these rivers then are really lush in terms of vegetation, and thankfully are, left unscathed to a very large extent. And I would ask you to keep those pictures in your memory as we move on towards the end of the webinar. And just remember what a river should look like. And I'll show you then what some of our rivers do look like, in fact. And again, as you go through these pictures, you can see changing geology all the time. This is one that has quite a lot of bank erosion because of the fact there was no bank protection. All of the vegetation was taken out, but a much, much harder rock. And this is a much rockier river than the limestone rivers we saw earlier. And these are all typical of the different geologies that you see in Ireland. This is the far west coast. You're into brown water streams, fast moving rivers, large rocks and cobble, not really productive in terms of producing resident fish, fantastic for salmon and sea trout that just want to come in, lay their eggs, grow loads and loads of baby fish that will then go out to sea to feed. Again, west of Ireland rivers with this very, very hard rock. In contrast then, just to show you how different our rivers are to rivers abroad. This is one of the lovely rivers in Slovenia. In many ways, the geology is quite similar to Ireland, but because you don't have the peat bogs and because you don't have the brown stain in the water, you tend to get these crystal clear pools. And what tends to happen is that the layperson tends to associate these sort of crystal clear pools with really rich rivers, whereas in reality, our rivers in Ireland can be extremely productive and still have a very strong brown tinge to them. So in terms of the life then that these rivers can actually hold, let's have a little look at the life without the backbone. This is an iconic fly here on the bottom right here of my screen. This is the mayfly. And this term causes some confusion because in North America, any fly with three tails, the North Americans tend to call mayflies, and that has come into our particular way of communicating the different insects as well here in Europe. So mayflies are really any fly with three tails as a nymph, as a larva or a nymph. In this case, these are the adults, but they still have three tails. But this is the big mayfly. This is actually of great economic importance in Ireland because we get a lot of tourist anglers coming over when this big mayfly is hatching to catch brown trout, because it's at that time the really big trout will come to the surface. Some of these creatures are 30 to 35 millimeters long, so they're very large. So the aquatic invertebrates then that we're looking at are commonly found throughout the watercourses in Ireland. They respond in terms of the different types of water quality that you might find. They respond in different ways. Some of them are very sensitive. Some of them then are extremely tolerant. Again, this is a mayfly, but this is a mayfly nymph. So this is the aquatic stage. 3 tails, very distinctive. Has a thorax, has a thorax here, has then a very distinctive wing case here, the head and the legs. And this particular area here splits then for the adults to emerge. And they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. These are very common ones. This large dark olive, this nymph is to be found practically throughout the whole year. Again, 3 tails, and it's a mayfly nymph, but a smaller one. This is actually the nymph of the very large mayfly that we started to speak about, and this is a burrowing mayfly. So lots and lots of gills on this particular mayfly. And what the mayfly does when he's in the burrow is uses the gills to keep the burrow free of silt, and can live up to 3 years in the bed of a stream or the bed of a lake. A very particular creature. This is a very important creature because it's super sensitive to pollution. And if you can find flat mayfly nymphs like this dragon type mayfly in your stream, you know then that your water quality is very good. There's also a sister species that's hugely sensitive, which is the stonefly, and it has 2 tails. And the stoneflies, this particular creature here, you can see there's a broken tail because they're very sensitive when you're trying to collect them. You can easily break a tail off, but still very clearly you can see that there's 2 tails, and 2 tails in this guy here as well. And the sedgeflies are really important as well. They go through the exact same cycle as a butterfly, in that you have the egg, you have the larvae, you have the chrysalis, and then you have the adult. In this case, larvae, and we call this chrysalis the pupae, and then the adult. The aquatic stage, then the adult stage emerges. We have these wonderful looking sedgeflies that don't have any cases at all. They live freely on the bed of the river. And these are really important because, again, they're quite sensitive to pollution. But then other forms actually make a very specific case. And in many cases, the case that the caddis makes to protect itself is actually the design of it is imprinted in the egg genetically, because the cases tend to be very, very similar for particular species, which always to me is mind-boggling how nature has actually come to that particular stage where it can imprint in an egg the actual design of the case of the caddis. There's an apocryphal story about a jeweler in New York who put the cased caddis to work by taking them out of their cases and putting them in with crushed gold and crushed diamonds. And then he started a trend. He started to sell what he called bio-jewelry. So when the caddis had done their job, he took the caddis out of their cases and he had made beautiful jewelry pieces out of the cases themselves. I don't know how true that is, but I love the story. In terms of the pupae then, this is the caddisfly that will be moving up towards the surface to hatch as an adult. They're extremely important to the fishermen because they're a very juicy morsel for the trout. And then we have lots and lots of other sorts of wonderful creatures, midges, damselflies, dragonflies of all sorts that you find in Irish waters. Lots of other creatures like this water louse. Then you have the shrimp in different forms, all sorts of different snails. And all of these snails will have certain sensitivities to certain water types. All of them will have beautiful shapes and beautiful colors, and all of them are really important that we retain them in the densities and in the varieties that we have them. We have lots of different bugs. These are really important to the ecology of a stream, but very little regarded because they're not nearly as handsome or as cuddly as some of the land creatures that you might look at. So therefore, these tend to be shunned, but from an ecologist's point of view, they're very important. And these are the famous water boatmen, which you get in still water and you get in lakes as well. And these are creatures that mainly inhabit slow-flowing water, but again are all part of the wonderful mix that makes up our water courses here in Ireland. We have some wonderful densities of these crayfish, but unfortunately the freshwater crayfish in Ireland at the moment is going through quite a vicious trauma because unfortunately a disease has hit these creatures at this stage, and the crayfish are under quite a lot of pressure from what's called the crayfish plague. But hopefully they're resilient enough to be able to move beyond that in the years to come, and indeed some courses are still free of the plague. So just to talk very briefly then a little bit about the vertebrates that we find in Irish waters. So the first creatures that would have come in after the ice were the char. The char are a very close relative of the trout, and we still have good populations of char on some of our bigger lakes. The next to appear then were the trout, and then after the trout then were the salmon. So these are generally the fish that Ireland is associated with. The rainbow trout has made a major appearance in Ireland since the 1920s, but all rainbow trout in Ireland are stocked. We don't have any now. We had one stage. We don't have any self-reproducing populations of rainbow trout. The other native fish that are on the screen here are the sticklebacks. And this particular fish here, the rudd, we're not absolutely sure about the rudd, whether it's one that was brought in or whether it's a native fish. But certainly the bream was imported, and there's a big discussion going on about pike, but I firmly believe that pike were imported as well, but a long time ago, probably as long ago as around 950 to 1000 AD. So they're with us so long now, it's a case of, I think we have to really adopt them. But we have an immense amount of fish, and that's just to give you a flavor of the types of fish that we have. Just to talk a little bit then about climate change and about what is happening in terms of climate change. There is no doubt about it that waters are getting warmer, the storms are getting stronger, and the availability of food resources in and from the ocean is now under threat. We have very major changes happening. And if you look at the map of Ireland and Britain here, you can see that Ireland is in a very special place in relation to changing oceans and in terms of climate change. We're on the very edge of Europe, and we're on the interface between the very warm seas to the south and the very cold seas to the north. So what is happening on the west coast of Ireland reflects greatly what's happening throughout the rest of Europe, North and South Europe. So we're in an ideal position to understand what is happening. But these basic figures here, which we used in a publication almost 10 years ago now, they tell the story of what did happen. 1985, if you look at the amount of yellow in the map, that's all you have to look at. And as you look at the amount of yellow actually increasing, the amount of yellow increased then to 92, to 99, to 2006. And that's basically the water temperature increasing. And that's 2006. That's now 14 years ago. But the big change happened around 1989, 1990. We also have had very clear indications over the last 10 to 20 years that we had problems, and we have done very little about it. So the Heritage Council, for example, in 2009, they very clearly indicated that we were going to see more extreme precipitation events. We're going to see changes in terms of the intensity and duration of these events, the frequency of flood events. So those things were presaged by these various reports, and indeed well before that. And yet the action was not taken. We made lots and lots and lots of committees, and we had lots of discussions. We didn't take the actions. So this is a research station in Burrowing in the west of Ireland that I was working in for about 20 years. I left to start my own business about 10 years ago. But while I was there, we had one of these flood events. And we were fortunate, and this picture may not look like the picture of somebody who was fortunate. We were fortunate in that we had our instruments sitting under this event. So we were able to actually understand exactly what happened. And what happened was this. in a matter of about 2 hours, we had 55 millimeters of rain. Basically, we had 2 inches of rain in 2 hours. We had 4 landslides and we lost 3 bridges in a very, very concentrated event. We also then started to look at how we might be able to use the large climate models. And we did a very major study doing what we called downscaling, where we actually reduced one of these great big models down to a catchment scale or a watershed scale to look at what was going to happen out to about 2080. And what we saw very clearly was that there was going to be an increase in terms of temperature, particularly in the colder months. There was going to be very large increases at times in terms of precipitation, and there was going to be very large increases in terms of stream flows. A lot of these were very focused around particular points in the year. There was nothing gradual about this. They were vicious and they were violent, according to the models. And certainly in terms of droughts, we were seeing simulations that were telling us the droughts were going to be very severe, as well as the very wet years. And that's exactly what we have been seeing, is what we were simulating, if you like, at that particular time. As I mentioned, in terms of insults and in terms of impacts, certainly we've had our share of those in Ireland. We've been fortunate, certainly since around the year 1985 or so. Our water pollution situation, we've managed to improve that greatly. And I think we just started on that rising curve just in the nick of time. We certainly need to be very conscious of it, but I think that's on the upward swing. One area though, and I'll use this as a single example for tonight's webinar, one area where we're really struggling is the whole question of flood control and flood relief. And there has been a tradition in Ireland of very major arterial drainage schemes, because all of that central plain that I showed at the very beginning of the webinar, it tends to hold water. It holds vast quantities of water. So from a farmer's point of view, if you're losing your field for maybe 5-6 months of the year, you would think it would be a very good idea to lower the bed of the river, get rid of the water, and have the land there the whole time. So on that very simple premise, there was major arterial drainage schemes in all of these rivers right up to 1986. These were massively expensive undertakings. And this photograph on the bottom left, this photograph still affects me because I had just written articles for a British trout fishing magazine claiming this river to be one of the best trout rivers in Europe, which it was at the time. I went back about 2 months later and this is what I found. There was no consultation, there was nothing else. The diggers moved in because there was some flooding problems in this area, and the whole bed of the river ended up on the riverbank. That spoil heap there was full of snail shells. It was full of all sorts of remnants of crustacea. There was all sorts of life forms, including plants and that, thrown up on the bank. And this really was indicative of some of the damage that was done in Ireland. Here's some of the major drainage schemes. This was typical of the design, what they call a trapezoidal design. So you took your riverbed out, then you put in these slipping banks on either side. This bank hasn't been done yet. You left a very big muddy channel in the middle. You tried to get a gradient in and you got rid of the water as quickly as you could. And this was replicated time and again in many of the very best rivers in the country. This is the Clare Galway River in East Galway. The river itself originally flowed in that area there. It's been lowered right down to here. In many cases in the limestone rivers, dynamite was used to blow out blockages to try and get rid of the water. And also you will see that, just the bit of field you can see there, there's no great miracle. This didn't work from an agricultural point of view. It just didn't do what it was supposed to do. And yet, as I say, the amount of funding that was made available for it was enormous. We then got a flavour of what was to come in terms of Hurricane Charlie in 1986. And Hurricane Charlie in 1986, it gave us 11 inches of rain just outside of Dublin on a hill called Capure. And we had 7.5 inches in 24 hours in one particular location on the River Dodder. So the Gaelic name for the Dodder is An Dubhra, which means the deluge. And it and the Dargle rivers hugely overflowed. Unfortunately, people were drowned in this particular event. And 2 large reservoirs in South County Dublin on the River Dodder very nearly topped and very nearly broke as a result of the pressure. And that was an indication of the power of water in these big flood events. Hurricane Charlie was very early on, may very well have had very little to do, if anything to do, with our climate change issues now, but it did make a very clear picture in terms of what would happen in the future in relation to our flood events. Then we had this other major flood around 2015, 2016. Again, there were other floods before that. This particular event, and the very recent event, there was a huge clamour afterwards. We really must do something. We must protect these houses. Who could argue against that? We must protect these houses. We must protect that road. So what do? You send in the dredgers and you start lowering the rivers where the actual river itself has had a problem. So this is the river Bandon in County Cork, and this is Bandon town. There's about 3 kilometres of river now that the bed of the river has been lowered by 3 meters. And the reason for that, and again, as I say, nobody can argue against this, is to protect the townspeople, to protect the buildings. But the reason the river has flooded has nothing to do with the fact that the water ended up in Bandon. The reason the river has flooded is because of very poor land management in the upper reaches. So this is not, in effect, tackling the actual cause of the flooding. It's tackling the impact of the flooding. And that's the issue that really I'd like to raise this evening, is that we really must find a new paradigm. We have to find a new way of doing this. We need nature-based solutions. We need to try and prevent the flooding and not have just short-term flood relief. And I think the pendulum is beginning to turn now. I think it's beginning to tick, and I think we're beginning to see change. And we must start thinking about rebuilding our catchments. Now, the problem is that this is not something that's fast. This is not going to solve this particular problem tomorrow. It's going to take probably a decade or more to reinstate the bogs, reinstate the wetlands, bring in new farm management, innovative farm management, try and get people to engage in environmental stewardship and to adopt a stream and to start looking after the stream. Because we need to manage not just the extreme high water, but also we need to manage for extreme low water, and particularly extreme low warm water now in the context of climate change. One very simple change that we can institute straight away is to try and encourage people not to use the term channels. When you talk to anyone involved with flood relief or drainage, they always use the word channels. And this is shorthand for what's left after they have done their work. I would argue that rivers are living, breathing creatures, and certainly far from channels. And that's something I think that we could start with, is actually looking at that. Increasingly then, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a real role here for the citizen scientist, because the citizen scientists can actually gather the information that we need in terms of the arteries in the upper reaches of the rivers themselves. They can do a really fine job in terms of looking at what is happening in terms of invasive species. And we certainly have our problems there in terms of Japanese knotweed, in terms of Himalayan balsam, and most recently the invasion of Asian clams. And again, this is fairly common throughout the world, where people are seeing invasive species arrive just at the time when the actual climate itself is changing. And in some cases, these particular creatures lavish the idea of actually being able to spread and to thrive in the waters as they get warmer. We have some creatures that are on the very edge of coming over to Ireland. So we have these killer shrimp already in the UK, and these creatures really do make mincemeat, no pun intended, of the smaller soft-bodied invertebrates that we saw earlier. And we need to keep those killer shrimp out of Ireland. There's a very big program at the moment of awareness being run by the Biodiversity Centre down in Waterford. Also, all of the councils and so on in the country are doing a great job making people aware in terms of the impacts these invasive species may have. And certainly, as I say, I think the volunteers can play a major role in terms of raising awareness in relation to the status of our rivers at the moment, raising awareness in terms of the photographs I showed you of the pristine waters that we have left in Ireland, and that with a determined effort, we can certainly get to a situation where we can at least partially restore these beautiful watercourses. And remember, the watercourses that we're restoring have a real economic value. The value of that clean water to the farmers, the value of that clean water to the towns, the value of that clean water to the recreational industry that's in Ireland, and also the value of the water as potable water, of course, and water for us to drink and to survive is really, to a large extent, invaluable. We have been absolutely blessed in Ireland in terms of our freshwater resources. And as I say, I think that if each of us adopt the attitude of not attempting to actually change the whole world, but certainly attempting in a very real way to change our little piece of it, I think it could make a really major difference. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Ken. That was amazing, very inspiring, informative. And some reasons for optimism, I think, even though quite a lot of work to be done to get where we need to be. A comment here from Donna, who says it was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. And we have some questions. Deirdre says, thank you, Ken, so informative. What can we do for our local rivers in Ireland to get them back to their best state for fish and wildlife? My home river is the Meig in County Limerick. What can we do to help?
I think really the most important thing is raising awareness, because the communities, as I said earlier, and this is a firm belief of mine, I think they can really major with the smaller water systems. To a very large extent, the larger water systems are well looked after by very committed groups of people in the EPA and the councils. But I think those smaller water courses are really waiting to be, they're waiting to be championed. And one particular type of water course that I have a major interest in are small coastal streams. The issue with small coastal streams is the fact that they're not connected with any bigger rivers. They don't get the profile that big rivers get, or indeed tributaries of big rivers get. And I know from some of the research that the Atlantic Salmon Trust has commissioned that some of these tiny little individual water courses along the coast, they have unique biological treasures in them in terms of the fish and in terms of the fauna. And they again could be looked after and championed by the local groups. And I think by doing that, they can raise awareness then in terms of larger debates within communities, debates about whether or not there should be flood defence scheme. If a flood defence scheme is going to go into a particular location, and as I say, it's very hard to argue when there's property and lives perhaps at risk, but maybe a debate could be had as to how we can do this better in the future. And remember, every flood relief scheme that's put in place will have to be maintained. And we really do need to think about 5 years ahead. Do we go back into the Bandon? We go back into the Meig and tear everything back out of it again to try and retain the actual engineering spec that was there 20 years ago? I think not. I think we have to really be much more innovative. And I really feel that individuals within these groupings can get this debate going. And I think given the political situation we have in Ireland at the moment, where we have the Green Party as actually part of the government, where we have a very good climate change plan, we really need to see that actually actioned. And I think that's where individuals can really make a difference.
Thanks, Ken. Just to say, Deirdre, the Meig is one of the few rivers in Ireland that actually has a Rivers Trust. So that represents a great opportunity to get some really positive work done on the River Meig and to get some really good community involvement. So they have a website if you want to have a look at that, meigriverstrust.ie. And they actually have full-time staff now. Liz Gabbett is the project officer for the Meig Rivers Trust. So there's a great opportunity there for the trust and for the River Meig. So hopefully we'll see big improvements in that in the future. Marie says, in Glynn, we have large round white foam circles in the local river after heavy rain. What could they be?
I think that it could very well be, and again, I can only guess, and the most important thing is to contact your Law Pro officer. There's a very good website called Waters and Communities, and your local Law Pro officer is basically the interface between the community and the people in the councils and the EPA look after your water quality. But I would guess that probably what you're looking at is a treatment plant that probably isn't up to scratch. And we have quite a number of those around the country. There are plans afoot to try and improve on those, but there is a fairly constant problem in a river that I know that seems very similar to what you're describing. And largely it's down to the fact that the treatment plant gets to a stage where it's at capacity, goes beyond capacity, and then you start to see the discharges coming in and mixing some of the effluent with the fresh water. But as I say, I'm only guessing, and the best thing is to have a chat with your Law Pro officer or indeed talk to the council about it.
The next question, Ken, is from Enda, and he says, how can we deal with silt in our rivers?
Yes, silt is a big issue, particularly post-drainage. The River Boyne in particular has huge areas of silt in it that gather because of the fact that the actual drainage channel isn't really what the river intends in terms of a particular location. The best way of actually getting rid of the silt is by major engineering works on the rivers themselves. So you can increase the flow rate, and you can actually then lead to a situation where you can actually move some of that silt. It's a very, very complex area, because if you're dealing with a very big channel, it's a very expensive situation, and it may be that in certain locations it may not be possible to remove all of the silt, but you certainly can at this stage. You can avoid a build-up of silt in terms of any new planning that might take place. And I would imagine at this stage that a lot of the newer schemes that are underway in terms of flood relief schemes and so on, they're well aware of avoiding that issue. It's mainly in the old schemes that you get these big build-up of silt.
Here's an interesting one, Ken. I don't know if you've got opinions on either of these issues. Do you have any thoughts of reintroducing beaver, and any thoughts on the removal of Ardnacrusha? Two big issues there.
I'm smiling to myself in relation to the beaver, because two of my colleagues and myself, we have heated debates about every second week in relation to beavers. As Anne mentioned, I work as research director with the Atlantic Salmon Trust, and beavers have been reintroduced into Scotland. There's now a big debate about whether or not they should be reintroduced into England. Certainly, as far as I'm aware, we've never had beaver in Ireland. I don't think it's a matter of reintroducing them. I think it'd be a matter of introducing them for the first time. And certainly, I would think that at this stage, if we can manage what we already have, I would not be in favour of introducing any more aquatic organisms. I think really we have already got our invasive species, and we have a lot of our native species that we really are struggling to try and make sure that we can maintain them. I certainly would think that it would be really, a step backwards to introduce any exotic species in terms, certainly in terms of beaver. And they're beautiful creatures. Don't get me wrong. When I'm working in Canada and that, I really enjoy seeing them. But I really think, thank you very much, we could do without them. And then in terms of Ardnacrusha, well, that's a $1 million question, I'm afraid. There is a huge effort going on at the moment to look at how fish passage can be improved at Ardnacrusha. There's been some major initiatives taken, and we're awaiting now the results of a review of fish passage, certainly at Ardnacrusha. And I think if we can improve fish passage, in reality, then a lot of the other creatures, whether it's the salmon, which are the obvious one, or the trout, but most importantly, things like lampreys and eels and so on, and indeed some of the invertebrates, may benefit hugely. So there is, as I say, there is serious consideration ongoing at the moment to improve passage beside Ardnacrusha. So hopefully that'll come to pass over the next few years.
We have a few more interesting questions here for you, Ken. This is from Michael. He says, can we look forward to less suspended solids with the reduction in exploitation of peatlands?
Yes, I think that's the case. Just on Tuesday, I was looking at an area of bogland that I used to work on. I worked for about 6 or 7 years on a big contracted job with Bord na Móna, looking at the potential use of bogs in East Galway, which never really came to pass, but we spent a good few years doing a very early stage environmental impact assessment on them. And certainly the control bogs that we looked at in Offaly, there was huge quantities of silt ending up in the rivers at that particular time. I think that if care is taken to make sure that, as is happening at the moment, we get really good vegetation back on the surface of these particular boglands, that'll help. I also think we have to look as well in terms of retaining any of the silt that may be trapped in terms of some of the bigger wetted areas within the boglands.
Here's one, Ken. It's from Ben. Ben says, great webinar. Hypothetically speaking, if a community group were to adopt a local river or stream, what would be the top 3 actions you would advise community to take if they were aiming to improve, enhance, protect the quality of the water body in the short or long term? I
think the first step isn't so much to jump in and start doing things. The first step really is to do an appropriate audit. You could help greatly by, with the permission of landowners, being able to walk these streams and to be able to then assess what is happening in the various streams. I think that would be absolutely the first action. The second action then would be perhaps go look for some training so that you can actually then make sense of what you're seeing in terms of what's in the river itself. And then thirdly, in terms of locations, as we were talking about earlier, in terms of Glyn and so on, where there are problems, getting an activity group, a group together that can actually start to articulate their concerns with a view to actually getting solutions. So I think if you had those 3 things, where you actually knew what you were talking about in terms of doing an audit or doing a walk over the streams, getting some training so that you can actually do an assessment that is actually meaningful and that actually relates to the issues that you might come up with and understanding those issues. And thirdly then is taking action in the form of being an advocate for improvement in terms of the river or the stream. I think those 3 actions, if you were to take those in any community in Ireland, would be hugely beneficial to our rivers and streams.
Here's a big one from Padraig. As land managers, what can farmers do to improve water quality?
Well, interestingly, my own experience over the last 4 or 5 years dealing primarily with younger farmers has been hugely positive, in the sense that these young farmers are very well educated, very well aware of the need in the context of their own needs and in the context of the community's needs, to actually look again at how landscape is managed and how lands are managed. And I think that the most important thing that the young farmers can do is to actually start looking in the streams themselves. And there is now a very novel system that's been produced by a researcher in University College Cork. And by simply looking at a few of the invertebrates that I flashed across the screens this evening, the farmer can actually see what sort of job he or she is doing in terms of seeing if the water quality is up to scratch. And I think that rather than bombarding farmers with lots of talk about phosphorus and nitrate and nutrient budgets, that if they could start to think again about their own streams, about what used to be in their streams, what they can get back into their streams, and the net value in economic terms of getting those clean streams back into their land, that would be hugely beneficial. On at least 4 different occasions in recent years, farmers have said to me, oh, when my grandfather was here, there used to be salmon spawning up here. And I just basically said, well, why not now? And that was a great opening for me, to get them to understand that their goal could be to get salmon back spawning at the back of the Haggard as they were 50 years ago, and that they themselves can contribute to this. So I feel very passionately about this involvement with forestry people and with farmers. These are people of the land. These people understand water, but we have to take a very different view in terms of how we approach this, so that we bring people with us and they understand the net benefit to them as well as the community of actually protecting and improving the water resources.
Francis has asked what training might be available.
Well, what's available at the moment is there's several different levels of courses available. There's a course available that's primarily for engineers and for professional people, and that's an assessment format that's run in conjunction with consultancies such as Aquafact. It's also run in conjunction with the EPA. And then there are several different community initiatives. my colleague in Cork, he's doing some training at a very basic level. I run some courses as well. But the most important thing, I think, is to contact, again, your Law Pro officer. If you look up Waters and Communities, look up that website, look at your local Law Pro officer's details, get in contact with he or she and ask their advice, because certainly there is training available and there is certainly lots of support available to people in terms of looking to try and learn more about how they can do an audit on a river.
And I know the Meg Rivers Trust from time to time offer training in river assessments as well to community groups, so maybe keep an eye on that too. And here's a question in from Tom of the Rivers Trust. A question in relation to addressing impacts of drainage in small streams. How can we change the emphasis from larger streams to smaller order streams?
Well, again, I think to some extent maybe I answered that earlier, and I think that if we had a really detailed overview of what was in those streams before the plans are actually put in place to do anything to those streams, you have a much stronger case then for at least being able to tone down the amount of works that might take place on them. In terms of re-establishing those streams and in terms of improving those streams, again, a quantitative audit of streams where you can identify physical works or conservation works that are required would make quite a difference, because those little streams bounce back very quickly. But the most important thing is knowledge about those streams.
I have two questions here, Ken, that I might put to you together because they're kind of related. One is from Tom. He wants to know if riparian buffer zones are important in maintaining river health, and if so, are there specific sections of rivers that should be targeted for these? And the second question is, are greenways along rivers a good idea?
Yeah,
related.
Yeah, they are related. I'll come to the greenways one in a minute, because that's a bit more difficult. In terms of the nature strips, if you like, along by the sides of rivers, one of the most impressive ones that I have seen is in close enough to the city centre here on the River Camac in Clondalkin. And what the council have done is they've left 2 or 3 meters of wilderness along the margins of the river, to such an extent now that when you get down into the river itself, you would really imagine you were in the centre of Ireland, not beside playing pitches. And when you emerge from this nature strip and into the playing fields where the kids are playing their Gaelic football and their hurling and so on, it's extraordinary to realise that they're getting the benefit of being able to see nature at its very best in the centre of the city. So again, I'm a big fan of those linear parks, of that idea of having nature strips along by the rivers. To some extent, yes, that's, again, it's a good question as to whether or not it should be everywhere. I don't think it should be everywhere, but I think, again, if you get some advice, Law Pro, I will keep mentioning them because I think they're a great source of contacts for you. You will get some advice in terms of exactly the locations that will benefit most from some of those conservation zones. I think that would be that would be the right way to approach it. In terms of the greenways, I think we have to be very careful in terms of the greenways. In that, certainly there have been some controversies very recently down south in relation to this. I think that if you're going to have a greenway, I think you need to keep it back from the riverbank itself in general. And you need to make sure that you have this conservation strip or this biodiversity strip between the actual greenway and the river itself. It's not a matter of going in and manicuring the bank so that somebody can actually cycle along the side of the bank. What we're trying to do is make sure that we have all that vegetation, that we have that shade, that we have the undercut banks. Again, I think it can be managed, but I think it needs to be managed and planned at the very beginning, not at a stage when there's already a controversy. And some of the ones that have been done are exemplary, but in the past, we did have some really serious issues in relation to people being over enthusiastic in terms of trying to get access into the river for various community initiatives. And I think it's a balance between the two things.
We have a comment in here from Peter. He says, thanks, Ken, for a very well composed and informative presentation. As a related point of interest, I know that Bat Ireland, at least in the past, have done surveys of the success of the Dalbenton bat as a metric for the health of the river. So that's an interesting piece of information.
Yeah.
Mike says that some of the challenges we see in the management of the rivers are local authorities, Irish Water, Inland Fisheries, OPW. Interesting. Also, overflow discharges in our sewer networks are causing problems when they get blocked. That's certainly a problem.
Yeah.
And he says great work being done by the May Rivers Trust.
I should mention as well, and if I should, because I didn't mention the trust near enough in terms when we were talking about it, you did mention in terms of the training. Certainly there's a growing network of trusts now. Anne and I are involved with a few, and certainly they are go-to people in terms of enthusiasm, in terms of knowledge, and in terms of access to various opportunities in relation to that. Again, in the context of, I think that Anne's comment there harks back to what we were talking about earlier, this whole issue of storm overflows, the linkages in with treatment plants and so on. People are much more aware of this now. It's going to take time and money, I think, to sort those out, but certainly there's now a very clear list that has to be actioned in terms of what's required. Again, that ties in very closely with climate change, because if we get these massive flows of water, there's a real risk that we get very major discharges. But thankfully, they do tend to happen when we have very major dilution factors as well. So it's a combination of things. But as we said on numerous occasions in the last 20 minutes or so, awareness is everything in terms of people being aware of the need to make sure that the pressure is kept on, that their particular location is actually treated fairly in terms of getting resources to improve the water quality.
I think maybe we'll take one last question, Ken. It's from Tom again. What, in your view, are the impacts of older Quailcha conifer plantations on salmonid spawning in small streams in the west of Ireland in particular?
Yeah, I did some work on this in the past when I was working in Burrowing, that research lab that you saw there. And we had one particular area that there was a very large forestry plantation, and you could only say that it gave employment. That was about it in terms of why and where it was located. It resulted in the acidification of a small stream to such an extent that it used to actually attract in tourists, because it was so clear, so clean, there wasn't even algae in it. It was absolutely dead as a result of the acidification from the conifers. So in terms of the actual harvesting of the conifers, as I understand it, there's now a requirement that people take into account any previous impacts and so on before any replanting takes place. I also understand that in that context, it has to be mixed. It has to be a mixture of deciduous trees and conifers. But certainly using just conifer plantations in the past on very poor acidic soils led to all sorts of serious problems, but hopefully that's a thing of the past now. Okay,
thanks, Ken. There was a few questions we didn't get around to, but we've run out of time, so I might send those on to you or get comments from you on them. And
yes, glad to do that, Anne, yeah.
Okay. So listen, thank you all for attending tonight's webinar, and thank you very much, Ken, for a really informative evening.
My pleasure, Anne, and thanks to everyone for your questions. I enjoyed it.
Good night now.